So, in 1787, you had some of the leaders of the United States get together in Philadelphia in order to create a new government at the Constitutional Convention. So this happened in 1787. At this convention, they revised the Articles of Confederation. You can see some of the demographics of the delegates. All male, all white, average age 42. You had business leaders, plantation owners, governors. Half were college graduates, and lots of lawyers. Now, at this Constitutional Convention, there were two revision plans. One was called the Virginia Plan. Now, the Virginia Plan favored the large states, states with large populations. It favored a strong central government. It had a bicameral two-house legislature. The larger house was elected by the people, which was called the House of Representatives, and the smaller house was selected by the larger house, and the smaller house was called the Senate. Now, today, in our current government, you do have a House of Representatives, and you have a Senate. Okay, the House of Representatives, however, is elected democratically, as is the Senate. However, the 17th Amendment created the ability for people to democratically elect senators. So you had the Virginia Plan, which favored the large states with a strong central government. You also had the New Jersey Plan, which agreed with the strong central government, but Congress would be unicameral, one house, with states having equal votes. So just because you had a state that had a larger population didn't mean you got any extra representation. Basically, they did not want states with large populations to dominate the legislature. So those that advocated for the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan, they fought back and forth, and then you had a compromise, which was necessary in order to form a new government called the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. This created a bicameral legislature in which the House of Representatives membership was apportioned according to the state populations, plus 3/5 the slave population. And you had an upper house, the Senate, which would have members from each state who are elected by state legislatures. And today, senators are popularly elected with the 17th Amendment in 1788. So the Great Compromise created this bicameral legislature with the House of Representatives and the Senate. So remember, in the House, you have the number of seats. Each state has a number of seats in the House that is proportional to their population. In the Senate, every single state has 2 members. And this all stemmed from this Great Compromise. Now, another compromise that happened during this Constitutional Convention was the 3/5 Compromise, which agreed to allow the South to count 3/5 the population in each state to balance the power of the North and South. The southern states and the northern states had a back and forth regarding this. The South wanted slaves to count as a full person because that would give them more representation. The North didn't see it that way. The northern states did not see it that way. And so ultimately they made slaves 3/5 of a person to satisfy both the northern and the southern states. Now, some of the key Madisonian principles of the government in the Constitution, and these are absolutely key ideas. Popular sovereignty. The power to govern belongs to the people. Government is based on the consent of the governed. That is the idea of popular sovereignty. Separation of powers. There's division of government powers between 3 branches: the executive, the legislative branch and the judicial branch, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. You have checks and balances. This is a system where the branches have some authority over others. Limited government. Government is not all powerful. It only does what citizens allow it to do. And then federalism. You have a division of powers between central governments and individual states. And we're going to focus in at a later time a lot on federalism as well. So let's talk a little bit more about separation of powers. Now, separation of powers prevents an all-powerful ruling body. You have the legislative branch. They pass law. This is the Congress. The House of Representatives and the Senate make up the Congress, and their job is to create law. Okay? The national legislature, the Congress, is the legislative branch. They create, they pass law. The executive's job is to enforce the law. This is the President. The President of the United States, his or her job is to enforce the law, being a member of the executive branch. And then you have the judiciary. They interpret the law. This is the Supreme Court. That is their job, is to interpret the law. So this idea of separation of powers basically says that all the powers of government are going to be separated between three branches that ultimately will check and balance each other. And we'll go into this idea in more detail. So remember, the legislative branch writes law, the executive branch enforces the law, the judicial branch interprets the law. Now, the Constitution, ladies and gentlemen, can be amended. There's 4 ways to do it. We're going to talk about the one way that's the most popular. So it's meant to be difficult. It's not easy to change or amend the Constitution. It requires action from national and state governments. The most popular way that you have constitutional amendments is they are proposed by a 2/3 vote in each House of Congress, and then they're ratified by at least 3/4 of state legislatures. So it's proposed by the Senate and the House, ratified, accepted by 3/4 of state legislatures. All right, so during this process in which the colonies were deciding whether they were going to accept this new constitution or not, whether they were deciding whether they were going to ratify the Constitution, you had 2 very distinct sides that were debating. You had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So, once again, the colonies at this point were ratifying. They were formally approving the Constitution here. You had the Federalists. They were in favor of the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, and of creating a federal union and a strong central government. So the Federalists were a little bit more sympathetic to the idea that we need to pass this Constitution to create a strong central government. Anti-Federalists were the opposite. They were opposed to ratification in 1787. They were opposed to this strong central government. They were fearful of that. They were fearful that a strong central government would be tyrannical. So you had this debate going on back and forth between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and one of the great literary works that came from this Federalist-Anti-Federalist debate is the Federalist Papers. Some of the best political theory ever written in the United States, written by various founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay. And the purpose of the Federalist Papers was to convince the public for ratification. So one of the most famous Federalist Papers was the Federalist Number 10. It was written by James Madison, and here Madison addresses the biggest fear of government, the faction. The faction is a group in a legislature or political party acting together in pursuit of some special interest. So the Founding Fathers were concerned that our government would be ripped apart by warring factions, and they wrote about it in the Federalist Number 10. And in the Federalist Number 10, Madison defends our national Constitution. He talks about the fact that under the Constitution, you have a large republic, and that could better check the power of faction than the individual states that had a lot of power under the Articles of Confederation. Now, another famous Federalist paper is the Federalist Number 51, and here Madison writes about separation of powers, talks about how the separation of powers can check the growth of tyranny. He talks about how each branch of government keeps the other two from gaining too much power. He talks about how a republic guards against irresponsible direct democracy or common passions. He writes about how the majority, could, with some sort of political passion, overrun a minority and thus create laws that hurt a minority. And it is a republic that guards against this direct democracy, this common passion. And he talks about how factions will always exist, but they have to be managed so they do not overly burden the government and the political system. So, what did the Anti-Federalists feel about these Federalist papers? They believed the central government would threaten liberty. They believe the strong central government would eventually become a government of tyranny. They demanded a guarantee of individual rights and liberty. They believed the state's power was too limited. So at the Anti-Federalists' urging, in fact, insistence, the Founding Fathers created what's called the Bill of Rights. And this is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. They guaranteed individual freedoms and rights. They limited the power of the national government. They guaranteed rights to states. And ultimately, with the addition of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution was ratified. You had the Bill of Rights added in 1791. Now, it's important to understand that while the Constitution was ratified in 1789, and the Bill of Rights was added in 1791, several states would not have ratified the U.S. Constitution without the promise of the Bill of Rights being added in 1791 by the First Congress, and that is when the Bill of Rights were added. Okay. All right, let's look at the assessment. So for number one, we're going to describe the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, and why it was essential to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. And for number two, we're going to describe those 4 Madisonian principles of government that are included in the U.S. Constitution. And then we'll do the summary. So in a paragraph, describe what you have learned today. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.